Okay, yeah, thank you, Callie. So, like I said earlier, my name is Zach Kalinowski. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a second year law student at Washington University School of Law, and I am here to speak with you about mold tonight. So I want to begin by just having you think of a time when you've ever opened up your refrigerator or opened up your pantry or a cupboard and you found that the food that you were reaching for was completely covered in mold. So I want you to think about how that made you feel. Did you feel disgusted? Did you feel repulsed? Did you feel shocked? Did you lose your appetite? Were you concerned for your health and your well-being? Now I want you to imagine what it would be like to live in an environment where you're constantly surrounded by this mold. And of course, there are probably some of you in this audience tonight who live that reality day to day. So I also wanted to use this poll to ask you, did you know that you could lodge a complaint with the city if you are living in a moldy environment? Yeah, so that's kind of what I expected. Some would, some wouldn't. I'll go ahead and have Anna Catherine put a link in the chat for anyone who would find that helpful. So as you can tell by looking at this slide, if you are living in a majority Black neighborhood, you're also more likely to be living in a moldy environment. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with the poll here. So if you are living in a Black neighborhood, you are more likely to be living in a moldy environment. Like I said, the city does handle these mold complaints, which can sometimes lead to an inspection, which can even lead to citations for some of the underlying problems. However, there's really little protections in place after this inspection. So there's not a lot of mechanisms to hold a landlord accountable for fixing the problem. And it's really actually not uncommon for a landlord to retaliate if you do file one of these complaints. And if you've been to our meetings before, you can really basically just recognize this map, right? All of these dark red areas that represent moldy neighborhoods are again sitting in these speckled neighborhoods that represent majority Black neighborhoods. They're all concentrated in North St. Louis and in certain areas of South St. Louis. So it's really the same thing over and over, week in and week out. Now in St. Louis, generally mold spores are pretty common. So for a lot of us, that's just gonna mean seasonal allergies. It means you sneeze for a few months, then you get over it. Mold needs moisture to blossom from a spore into what we think of when we think of mold. St. Louis, of course, is very humid and moist though, so there is the opportunity for it to do so. A well-insulated and maintained home can help control this humidity and can also help keep some of these mold spores out. But as we saw last week with our high home energy burden presentation, impoverished communities are much less likely to have these well-maintained homes. And unfortunately, because of systemic issues, it's much more likely that Black residents of St. Louis are again going to live in these affected communities. Over half of St. Louis City residents are renters. So if you are having problems in your home and your home is in disrepair, you often have to rely on your landlord to fix it. You don't want to sink a bunch of your money into an investment that's not really yours. So it can create this helpless situation where if you have an unattentive landlord, you're left with the untenable decision to either spend your own money to fix the problem or just suck it up and live with the mold. And living with mold is absolutely a psychological problem. It's really disheartening to wake up every day and see mold on your walls. And it's extremely unfair that the Black community bears the brunt of this issue. However, it's more than just a psychological problem. Mold causes many physical health issues as well. These are mostly going to be respiratory diseases like asthma, allergies, or just general difficulty breathing. For most of us, home is a reprieve from these seasonal allergy symptoms. You can kind of check them at the door. But if you live in a moldy environment, you don't get that reprieve. You have to deal with it 24/7, 365. As we've seen in the past, asthma affects the Black community in St. Louis at an alarming rate. If you're Black in St. Louis, you're between 8 to 10 times as likely to be hospitalized due to asthma. So these two maps don't exactly line up. Part of that is that the map on the left uses wards, whereas the map on the right uses zip codes. But again, you can see that the neighborhoods with mold issues generally also have asthma issues and vice versa. So as I talked about earlier, mold can really seem like a helpless problem. Mold, to begin with, can be hard to see. Sometimes you'll be experiencing symptoms without even knowing that they're due to mold. So if you're someone who's had respiratory issues at home, you should probably look behind places like the fridge, down in the basement, or you can look under or behind other appliances that might be leaking because these are common places for mold to hide out of sight. Now, if you find that you do have a mold problem, it's often prohibitively costly for renters to deal with. This is especially true because the problem really mostly affects low-income people in the city. So when you look at these numbers, I want you to think about what they mean to you. Are they several months worth of groceries, new clothes for your children? Are they a car payment, rent, or mortgage? And of course, when we're looking at these higher estimates, they likely represent several months worth of pay and are really not feasible for virtually anyone to just shell out on a whim. In St. Louis, there's really no firm standard for mold either. There's nothing built into our occupancy codes and nothing built into our building codes. So it's really hard, like I said earlier, to hold landlords accountable and to have them fix the problem. There is what's called an implied warranty of habitability, which basically means that your landlord is responsible for making sure that the home is habitable, and mold can render a place uninhabitable. However, this is a battle that often has to be fought in court, which is incredibly costly. You have things like court fees, filing fees, and attorney's fees if you can even afford an attorney. And you are up against a landlord who, again, because this is usually a low income problem, is likely to have a better lawyer or at least even have a lawyer. So oftentimes you'll have an unrepresented tenant going up against a lawyer who knows all the laws, the rules, the procedures, and the rules of the game. And oftentimes this means that the tenant's going to be taken advantage of. And of course, if you withhold rent because you say that your apartment is no longer habitable and you lose, having that eviction on your record can make it incredibly hard for you to find housing in the future. So you just end up in this extremely high risk gamble where if you lose your ability to have housing in the future. But otherwise, if you don't take the gamble, you're just forced to live in a moldy environment. So the problems with mold and COVID-19 have been very cyclical in nature. Each one makes the other worse. So a lot of those pre-existing respiratory issues that we saw on the earlier slide may also make COVID worse. There's still some disagreement in the medical community what effect asthma has on COVID, but the CDC is still saying that it likely makes it worse. COVID also makes you more susceptible to a fungal infection, which is caused by a very common kind of mold called Aspergillus. Usually this only infects the immunocompromised. However, early research has shown that it also affects COVID patients. And that same research shows that cases of COVID that are accompanied by this Aspergillus are much more likely to be severe or even end in death. And much like with the problems with lead, COVID is also forcing people to stay at home in these moldy environments. So again, you're experiencing all those physical and psychological effects that we talked about earlier. People with asthma are now spending more time in these environments that are filled with asthma triggers. We've also seen that cleaning products can also trigger asthma. People are already cleaning more because of COVID-19, but if you have a mold issue, again, that's something that you're going to be scrubbing away at, and it's just another asthma trigger that you're going to have to deal with. So we haven't gotten any data on St. Louis. We know that cities like New York have suspended or limited mold inspections. Oftentimes in St. Louis, this is done through private companies here, but really whether or not it's suspended doesn't matter so much because when you're living through times where you're being told to isolate and socially distance, you're much less likely to invite strangers into your home. So you may be more likely to just either grin and bear it or again, try to shell out your own money to fix the problem. And of course, with COVID-19, people are on a more limited income. They've lost their jobs, their hours are being cut. So whether you're a renter or a homeowner, the last thing you want to do is sink a bunch of money into your home to try to fix the problem. So these are some of the problems with mold in St. Louis, but we're here to hear from you today. We want to learn about your experiences and hear what you think can help solve some of these problems. So we look forward to sitting down and listening to you in just a few moments. But before that, we'd like to open the floor to any questions, and I'm finished.